In this episode of the Breakdance Unleashed series, we will learn how to create this kind of nested parallax effect using Breakdance and Elements Hive. We'll start by creating the base structure needed for each card container. First, we'll add a div to wrap all the elements needed for each card. Next, we'll add a wrapper link element for linking to other pages. Then we'll add another div element to wrap the image. And finally, an image element. The final structure should look like this. Let's add an image from the media library and style it according to our needs. The first effect we will implement is the nested parallax linked to the page scroll. On the original website, when we scroll, it looks like images are moving in the opposite direction inside their containers, creating subtle visual feedback and adding depth to the design. On the image element, we will apply a scale of 1.2 using the transform settings to make it visually bigger. And we will visually hide the scaled portion of the image by applying an overflow of hidden on the wrapper link element. Next, we will define a scrolling animation on the image element for the vertical position. We want the image to move in the opposite direction of the scroll, so we will give it a start of -10% and an end of 10%. If we duplicate our work item structure a few times and test it on the front end, we can see the effect in action when we scroll. The images move opposite to the scroll direction, revealing parts of the scaled portions of the images that are hidden by default. We'll delete the duplicate items for now and implement the next effect. On the original website, we can see that the images rotate around based on the mouse's position, and we can also see a slight parallax effect being applied here as well, that adds more depth to the movement. On the wrapper link element, we will enable the Tilt 3D effect from Elements Hive and give it a maximum rotation of 5. The image now rotates based on the mouse's position, but we are still missing the parallax effect that we saw on the original website. To achieve this effect, we need to enable the Tilt 3D extension on a separate layer. Since the image element already has transforms being applied, applying the Tilt 3D extension directly would cause conflicting transforms. That's why we use a div element between the wrapper link and the image. On that div element, we'll enable the Tilt 3D extension and apply the same maximum rotation as the wrapper link element. Now we have a slight parallax effect based on the mouse movement as well. When we move the mouse around, part of the scaled portion of the image that's usually hidden becomes visible, giving more depth to the effect. The last thing we need to do is apply a border radius on the wrapper link element. Now that we have the nested parallax working on both scroll and mouse movement, we can tackle the mouse hover interaction that changes the background image. Before we duplicate our work item structure, we'll add a CSS class that will be common to all our work items. This will come in handy later on when we define our interactions. We'll add a new div element that will hold all of our background images. We'll give it a position of fixed and apply a width and height so that it always covers the whole screen. Next, we will add a few CSS classes to the first image. We need a common CSS class that will be common to all the background images, an active CSS class that makes the image visible, and a unique CSS class per image. On the common CSS class, we'll edit the selector and apply a blur filter. The blur filter will fade the edges of the image. To fix this, we can apply a scale transform. And by default, the images will be hidden, so we'll apply an opacity of 0. On the CSS class of the active state, we'll define an opacity of 1. And finally, define a transition on the CSS class of the default state. Now we can duplicate the image element and add the rest of the images that we have in our cards. On each of the duplicated images, we'll delete the active state CSS class and the unique CSS from the original image and add a unique CSS class with the correct suffix. Since the background container has a position of fixed and spans the whole screen, we need the images to be stacked on top of each other. We can do this by applying a display of grid and an items per row of 1. Then, on our CSS class for the default state of the images, we can apply a grid area of 1 by 1. We can now test our setup to make sure it's working by adding the CSS class of the active state to a background image. Now that we have the base setup in place, we can start replicating the effect using the Interactions extension from Elements Hive. When the user hovers on a work item, we want the corresponding background image to become active. On the first work item, let's add an interaction to do just that. The interaction will have trigger of self, an action of set attribute, an attribute type of class, a value with the active state class, a target of CSS selector, and a CSS selector with the unique CSS class of the first background image. When we test this in the front end, the first background image becomes visible when we hover on the first work item. But unlike the original website, the background image remains visible even when we are no longer hovering on the work item. For now, let's duplicate the interaction to the second work item and then update the target CSS class to the second background image. If we test it now, we can see that it's working. Hovering on a work item will make the corresponding background image visible. We can also see another issue. Once we hover on the second work item and then hover again on the first work item, the corresponding background image is not visible. To fix both this and the previous issue where the background image remains visible when hovering out, we need to add a couple more interactions that will remove the active state class at the right time. Since we have a common CSS class for all our work items, instead of creating the same interactions on each work item, we will define them just once on a parent container instead. On the section element, we'll add an interaction with a trigger origin of self, toggle the use child elements option, a child selector with the work item CSS class, a trigger of pointer enter, an action of remove attribute, a value with the active state CSS class, a target of selector, and a CSS selector with the common CSS class of our background images. This will remove the active state class from any background image that may have it when we hover on a work item, which will fix the last issue that we just saw. That looks better. Going from one work item to another changes the background image to the correct one. Now we just need to apply the same interaction when the mouse exits a work item. On the section element, we'll duplicate the existing interaction and change the trigger to pointer leave. Now it's working correctly. The last two work items, however, are still missing the interactions we defined, so we'll copy the interactions over and update the target CSS selector accordingly. Okay, that looks pretty good. In this episode, we learned how to create nested parallax effects using both scroll and mouse movement. This effect is not limited to what we saw. You can, for example, add more transforms for the scroll version, or use different parameters with the Tilt 3D for more variations. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel and click on the notification bell to be notified of future videos.